Hey there everyone. Today I'd like to discuss a fascinating essay by Maurice Blanchot, Mallarmé's Experience. Written in 1955, this is really a precursor to poststructuralist theory because he's going to be theorizing French symbolist poetry, particularly Mallarmé's poetry, and getting at its themes of self-reflexivity, of poetic autonomy, of ambiguity, errance, diversion, and technique in a way that I think is really helpful for shedding light on modernist poetry and philosophy as a whole, and really paving the way for the postmoderns. Some of the concerns going on in the philosophy of language and in the theory going on regarding language at the time. Blanchot opens with a quote from Mallarmé, where he says, "Unfortunately, by digging this thoroughly into verse, I have encountered two abysses which make me despair. One is nothingness, the absence of God. The other is his own death." And we're seeing right here at the outset that Mallarmé has a lot in common with Nietzsche in terms of grappling with a perspectival ambiguity resulting from the collapse of transcendence. And symbolist poetry is really keen on this idea that the poem is not supported by some ground or some transcendent buttress or structure outside of the poem which makes sense of it, which allows it to shine through. If it has any shine, it's only the result of the sort of contingent refraction within this milieu, within this matrix of splendor, so to speak. So Blanchot is really insistent on discussing the structural devices and themes that allow for elements within the poem to play with language's ambiguities and lacks, its inability to shine forth resplendently, and the way that it mediates on language's own capacities as mediation. He says that by digging into verse, the poem enters that time of distress, which is caused by the gods' absence. Mallarmé's phrase is startling. Whoever goes deeply into poetry escapes from being as certitude, meets with the absence of the gods, lives in the intimacy of this absence, becomes responsible for it, assumes its risk, and endures its favor. Whoever digs at verse must renounce all idols. He has to break with everything. He cannot have truth for his horizon, or the future as his element, for he has no right to hope. He has, on the contrary, to despair. Whoever delves into verse dies. He encounters his death as an abyss. And of course, this is, the characteristic extremity of French writing here, but I think that Blanchot is getting at something really important, which is the way in which language signals and symbolizes aspects of our normal life, our self-identity, aspects of the identity of the cosmos and the universe itself, the nature by which mediation occurs, and that there is a fundamental abyss here, which is the fact that there is no absolute ground, right? This is what the death of God means for poetry, for language, for concepts of truth, is that we can no longer be guided by a horizon of truth, because we see that that horizon is nothing more than, as Nietzsche would say, the will to truth. A contingently created mindset that assumes that truth, which is a very specifically philosophically codified idea, that should be our goal. Instead, we don't have some telos, hence we don't have the future as our element, and therefore we have no hope. But I think that one should think about this phrase the way that Henry Miller puts it: a world without hope but no despair. Without hope because there's no teleology, because there's no guarantee that our steps will lead beyond our moment. In fact, we're guaranteed to fall prey to the contingencies of our moment, to be unable to fully extricate ourselves from our moment. And yet, nevertheless, there is no despair, because we only need despair if we assume our referent and our goal is truth shining in all of its resplendence, is the goodness and fullness of the capacities of God or something like that, right? Instead, Blanchot finds in Mallarmé a pure exchange where nothing is exchanged, where there is nothing real except the movement of exchange. It is that language whose whole force lies in its not being, whose very glory is to evoke in its own absence the absence of everything. This language of the unreal, this fictive language which delivers us to fiction, comes from silence and returns to silence. And this is really important for writing, and I think that this is going to bear strongly on Derrida talking about writing, is that there's something fundamentally mute about writing. And this has historically been seen as a downside, that we need to activate writing with our voice, and that writing is passive, whereas the voice is active. The voice is where truth lies. If we need to make an oath, we say it, or we shake on it, or we do something beyond writing. But Blanchot here is really showing that there's a fundamental dynamism and excess of writing, which is the fact that it starts and ends with silence, the fact that the words on the page, they don't actually speak anything, right? I have to speak them, and I have to explicate them and create discourse around them. But nevertheless, it has a force which is to compel and impel the reader to discuss these discursive facts, the way that language is forced to spring forth and come back to itself. The fact that, really when we're reading a poem, at best, we are getting a way to change ourselves relative to this poem right now. We're not sort of escaping the poem in some transcendent sense, because how would we do that and still be talking about the poem? So this is why, hence, there is really nothing that is being exchanged here. There's no absolute transference, but rather there is a chain of signifying events that pulls itself along, and we ourselves are really an element in that poetry, because, right, this poetry is sort of meta-discursive in its ability to meditate on mediation and things like that. He says we are used to normal language, the kind of language that comforts us, that fills in gaps. We're used to it because it's useful. Through it, we're in the world. It refers us back to the life of the world where goals speak, and the concern to achieve them once and for all is the rule. Granted, this crude word, as he calls it, is a pure nothing, nothingness itself, right? Because it pretends to be full, to be able to account for all of the world, to be able to make sense of and communicate all aspects of the world. This is the kind of language that science is going to use. It presumes that empirical facts can be coded and codified into language and can give us truth claims. Just all we have to do is just turn it into language. It's that easy. But it is nothingness in action. That which acts, labors, and constructs. It is the pure silence of the negative which culminates in the noisy feverishness of tasks. And this is something that Saussure is saying, that language is not predicated on a presence, but rather an absence which is articulated through negation. So, for example, if I have the word bag, and I have this thing called a bag, I can list certain attributes about it to try to link the signifier to the referent here, and to the signified, this concept of bag. But if I had another bag, which I don't, but if I had another one, they would have some differences. And we would start to see that there is some disparity between the ability of one signifier to perfectly match onto one signified, because the signified has multiple referents that participate in it. As such, what we really have going here is normal language's capacity to discount difference, to truncate difference and bring it together, and there so doing to pretend that it can fully account for facts, that the schema is perfectly one-to-one determined by the content, when in fact all content underdetermines schemas, and any schema that we use to talk about empirical content has to actually, but we have to do some kind of leap. We have to step into language as an action, which is what symbolist poetry does, and it takes that action from the inside of the poem, and it says, okay, there's always excess in the poem, and there is a signifying capacity or force bred within the elements due to their relative negations of one another, their ability to resist one another and yet remain in confluence with one another. And this latent tension, allows for us as readers to make it into something meaningful. He says that in crude or immediate speech, this is our everyday language, language as language is silent, right? We use it as a tool without really thinking of it as this formal thing called language. But beings speak in it as a consequence of the use, which is its purpose, because that is, it serves primarily to put us in connection with objects, because it is a tool in a world of tools where what speaks is utility and value. Beings speak in it as values. This is a very sort of Nietzschean thing that's going on here. That really, what is speaking in something being valued is the active valuation. It is the autonomous impulse to impose a value on something and thereby to valuate it. So here, with everyday language, the concern is to use it as a tool, that language is always a means to some sort of outside end. But there's a problem here, which is that immediate language is perhaps, in fact, a relation with the immediate world, with what is immediately close to us, our environs, so it gets us in touch with our worlds. But the immediacy which common language communicates to us is only veiled distance, the absolutely foreign passing for the habitual, the unfamiliar which we take for the customary, thanks to the veil which is language, and because we have grown accustomed to words as illusion. Language has within itself the movement that hides it, and this is mediation. It is an illusion of immediacy. The fact that when I say bag, it just innocently reflects this thing's existence, this being. That it's somehow that there's something essential about this language which speaks to the bag, something independent of my language. But what's interesting for Blanchot is the essential language, or poetry for him, this is exemplified in Mallarmé, does not speak to some outside reference. It's not concerned with referentiality and therefore with correspondence or with truth or with absolutes, but rather it's concerned with the dynamics of mediation of language itself. It's fundamentally concerned with linguistic artifice, which is something that he's echoed earlier when he says nothing is more foreign to the tree than the word tree. Right? The tree doesn't speak, and there's nothing about the tree that has been compelled from itself to guarantee that the signifier tree is the right one, that it has some sort of a priori reason to accord with tree. And we know this because I can call it arbor as well, and that works. Right? I can call it all sorts of different things, and these in fact contradict one another. They're different words, different signifiers, used to talk about the same referent and the same signified. So what's going on here is we're seeing that the artifice of everyday language, of crude language as he puts it, is sort of breaking down, and we see the quietness of beings. And yet, as beings fall silent, then it is being that tends to speak, and speech that wants to be. The poetic word is no longer someone's word. In it, no one speaks, and what speaks is not anyone. It seems rather that the word alone declares itself. Right? So the agency of language, because we recognize, for example, when we read words that they have certain connotations, that they link to certain aspects of our world. And yet they do that without us having to force them to do that. They have a sort of tendency to impel us of their own volition, as if they had some sort of autonomous will of their own. This capacity of language, this latent ability to carry this tension and momentum with it, is fundamentally not speaking for any one subject. Right? Language doesn't have some unified voice which speaks for it. Rather, it speaks through disparateness. It speaks by the tension between words that don't resolve. And that's one of the key aspects of poetry, and particularly of symbolism for Blanchot, is this lack of resolution, the fact that tension reigns. Words, having the initiative, are not obliged to serve to designate anything or give voice to anyone, but that they have their ends in themselves. And from here on, it is not Mallarmé who speaks, but language which speaks itself. Language as the work, and the work as language. So this is fundamentally a question of linguistic artifice. It is not language trying to be some sort of object which it refers to. It is not language trying to be some philosophical system. It is merely language trying to be, right? It is trying to do things. It is trying to act and enact itself. And thereby, it doesn't designate anything outside of itself, because the purpose of poetry is not to designate, right? When I say some kind of math problem, supposedly these abstract ideas are supposed to designate real things in the world, real happenings, right? I can abstract a real situation into some sort of complex equation, some sort of differential equation that I can use to describe the dynamics of that thing that's going on. But poetry is different. It's not quite descriptive in the same way. Its goal is not simply to explain, but to elaborate, to investigate, to ambiguate and mystify. And this is why poetic language for Blanchot is opposed in many regards to this will to truth. It is not chiefly or primarily or even secondarily or tertiarily defined by the will to truth. Instead, it is a work, and I don't think that Blanchot might have intended it this way, but I think that it's important that the work works, right? It does work. It does something, and this is part of its agency or its autonomy. He says that it subsists by itself and rests upon itself. Yet, in this sense, it is a work like any work, like any object formed by professional intelligence and skillful know-how. So we can see that language is becoming an object of artifice of its own, just like, for example, a tool is that's used in a workshop, or something that's made with that tool in the workshop. In the same way, it becomes an object which comes from the transcendent realm that it's been theorized in and is brought down to earth, down to the level of practical bearings, but also of the sort of ambiguous concerns of us humans. The poem, he says, understood as an independent object, sufficing to itself, an object made out of language and created for itself alone, a monad of words where nothing is reflected but the nature of words, is perhaps in this respect a reality, a particular being having exceptional dignity and importance. But it is a being, and for this reason, it is by no means close to being, to that which escapes all determination and every form of existence. Right? So the poem is not some sort of perfect, transcendent, resplendent entity. It doesn't stand in for some kind of form, for example, like a Platonic form. No, it is itself just an object. Now, this doesn't diminish it. This doesn't diminish its aesthetic value really at all. It's just a shifting of our perspective of the way we view poetry and the actions that we expect it to be able to do and the things that we expect it to be doing. As such, poetry for Blanchot becomes, in the modern era, a search for origins, a want to identify the poem with its own origin, the concept of the pure work, right? This is what symbolist poetry is trying to do. It is trying to create something self-contained, something that might go well beyond what could possibly exist. But that's not the point. It's supposed to be surreal, excessive, and absurd. And yet it is supposed to be as wholly self-consistent as it can possibly be. To cohere and inhere, and by doing so, show that that is what signification is. It is that tension, that inherent tension, which inheres. When Mallarmé asks himself, does something like literature exist? This question is literature itself. It is literature when literature has become concerned for its own essence. And this is another defining aspect of modern poetry, of modern literature, of modern philosophy, is this self-reflexive questioning. The questioning of its own essence. Finnegan's Wake does this especially. One of the chief concerns of Finnegan's Wake is, what is textuality? Finnegan's Wake is a text, but it doesn't even really know the implications of that identity marker. What does that even mean? As such, the same time, it cannot be said that the work belongs to being, that it exists. On the contrary, what must be said is that it never exists in the manner of a thing or a being in general. In answer to our question, it must be said that it is literature that does not exist, or again, that if it does take place, it does so as something not taking place in the form of any object that exists. Right? So when we look at Mallarmé's poem, it is more than the material marks of the ink on the page, and it's more than the page that it's upon, and the collection of pages which come together to present us with a bound book. Obviously, it's more than that, right? It's a series of concepts, too, which are not just there on the page. They have to be formulated and invented. And it is also the effects that the poem is having on the reader. And also, it is the discourse, which is the Mallarméan discourse that results. It is the conversations that we have between each other as we interpret the poem. All of this goes together to fundamentally describe what the poem is. So it's more than an empirical referent. It is rather something that subsists in a new realm that is contingent upon the physical, upon the material, and yet it has some sort of contiguity between, at the interstices, between materials, between the marks on the page, right? Reading between the lines is really the very essence of poetry, because it is not the lines themselves which are the poetry, but the relations between the lines, the effects or acts of literature. Therefore, literature is always on the verge of passing from all to nothing. Words, Blanchot says, have the power to make things disappear, to make them appear as things that have vanished. This appearance is only that of disappearance. This presence, too, returns to absence through the movement of wear and erosion, which is the soul and the life of words, which draws light from their dimming, clarity from the dark. But words having the power to make things arise at the heart of their absence, words which are masters of this absence, also have the power to disappear in it themselves, to absent themselves marvelously in the midst of the totality which they realize, which they proclaim as they annihilate themselves therein, which they accomplish eternally by destroying themselves there endlessly. And this is one of the points of deconstruction that's going to be developed later, is that signification fundamentally underwrites itself. It undermines its pretensions to certainty, to truth, to referentiality, to surety, to closure, to unity. Instead, we get disambiguation, we get confusion, we get wear and tear and erosion, we get excess. So instead, we get an artifice which destroys itself endlessly in a process which invokes and invites and implicates the reader in this dialectical process. And it's not a dialectical process insofar as it is teleological, but insofar as it demands and invokes two poles, the reader and the work. And we might also say a third pole of the author. It invokes all these poles, and it dialectically churns over them, bounces off them back and forth. And what does it orbit around? Well, this is what Blanchot calls the central point. And the central point is defined by intimacy and risk. It exposes the reader. What does it expose us to? Well, it exposes us to the fact that everything is word, yet the word is itself no longer anything but the appearance of what has disappeared. The imaginary, the incessant, and the interminable. This point is ambiguity itself. And it affirms itself, Blanchot says, right? So it is an ambiguity and a gap which is pregnant with meaning and with potential. It is like a cloud that floats forth with ambiguity. Like the Hebrew term hevel, which means smoke, it means vanity. This is used in Ecclesiastes when it talks about vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Here it's talking about hevel. And I think that's really a quality of poetry that Blanchot is very interested in. This idea of a pregnant mystery that speaks forth without a ground. It speaks from the inability of anything to stand still. And therefore the central point is the presence of the work, and the work alone makes it present. right? So it's not an absolute present attested from on high, but rather a presence resulting from the relations between elements internal to the poem. It is the empty profundity of being's inertia, that region without issue and without reserve, in which the work through the artist becomes the concern, the endless search for its origin. In this central point, there is what he calls a concentration of ambiguity, and this seems to define modern poetry and postmodern art, literature, philosophy of all kinds, is a concentration of ambiguity which refuses to allay itself, which refuses to sit silently. Instead, what is not revealed in this flight is that there isn't something reflected outside of the pure grace, he says, of the presence, affirmed of real things turned into pure absence, pure fiction. It oscillates marvelously between its presence as language and the absence of the things of the world. This presence is itself oscillating perpetuity, oscillation between the successive unreality of terms that terminate nothing and the total realization of this movement, language. So we get this really monumentously influential theorization of what language is, of its evasiveness, which is typified in symbolist poetry like Mallarmé's, and is going to go on to influence critical theory and a postmodern theory in the French and its American varieties, and it is going to influence postmodern philosophy of all kinds. It is going to be super critical for understanding thought's relationship to certainty and the way that signification works. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me out and purchase the books necessary to bring you this kind of content, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.